Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. As I record this, the largest writers' strike since the COVID-19 pandemic is continuing in Hollywood. It's a strike of the Writers Guild of America, the WGA labor union, against the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. And it started on May 2nd. It's easy to see why the writers would strike. They're striking on a number of issues. One is the residual pay from streaming media that they write for. When you compare what those writers make with what actors, producers, directors make, the issue becomes pretty obvious. Although there's a number of actors actually that are out on the picket lines right now supporting the writers. The larger issue here, in terms of what we're talking about today, the dignity of writing, has to do with a culturally based disparagement of writers and writing in general. And I wanted to look a little bit at why that's so, and then spend more time talking to those of you who are either writers, as I am, or who support writers, and what you can do to preserve the dignity of that vocation. Writers have a hard time being taken seriously for a number of reasons, and one of them seems to be connected to why people in other so-called soft skills development are also disparaged. And I'm thinking about healers, psychotherapists of different kinds, caregivers. A lot of that gets lumped together under the category of feminine. And of course, in a patriarchy, all that gets discounted. And writers, of course, like Hemingway, were well aware of this, which was probably at least part of the reason for his masculine overcompensation. He never really did make peace with the fact that he was a writer as a professional. So that's part of it. I think another part of it is that writing doesn't produce something material in the way that scientific work, for instance, might. So when you're writing, you're generating ideas and not electricity. What you're creating, especially if you write fiction, doesn't have immediate worldly application, at least according to this argument. I think it actually does. But when you change an idea, for instance, you change all the actions and values that depend on that idea, as well as on the previous idea that it replaces. So there's enormous consequences to changing people's ideas, changing their minds, changing their hearts about things, which is one of the areas where writing is strong. Writing in general is associated with the humanities, depending on the kind of writing we're talking about. And the humanities get a lot of comparison in our culture with the so-called hard sciences. The patriarchal roots of all this become plain in the metaphors, I guess. And the humanities in general are themselves disparaged, even though they tell us why we should do things and why. A technical education that lacks any kind of education in the humanities is actually quite dangerous. Look at the emergence of AI and the reasons for justifying its intrusion into all kinds of spheres of life. People are losing their jobs right now because of it. As an educator, I see it all the time as well. You can tell when there's a missing humanities education at work when something like this happens, and the responses to it and the concerns about it are all after the fact. The kinds of things that could have been imagined by a writer in advance, and was imagined by many writers, actually. The science fiction shelves are full of novels about what happens if AI goes AWOL. Additionally, writing depends on imagination. Even technical writing, which I used to do professionally, depends on it. And the imagination itself is given short shrift in our culture unless it directly makes people money. We don't stop to think that everything that we do in life that's worthwhile has some connection to imagination. It's not just an add on or just another human capability. It's an active power at the center of who we are. Now, before we talk about preserving your dignity as a writer, your dignity, your sense of hope, your faith in yourself, I want to give you a small example of the kind of disparagement I'm talking about that all writers have to deal with. So, at the time I'm recording this, I've published, I think, 20 books, and I don't know how many papers and articles and book reviews. And even with all of that output, I still don't get paid well as a writer. You pretty much have to be a best-selling author to do that. Or somebody who's an extremely well-known public figure. You know, if you write, let's say, philosophy or psychology or whatever it is, you might make some money that way, but not much. So I got an email from somebody that I knew, I think maybe 20 years ago, and went to a school that I went to. And her email asked if I would be willing to look over her dissertation and tell her how to turn it into a book. And on top of all that effort, suggest ways that she could promote and market the book. The reason I mention this is because writers get requests like this all the time. And so do therapists, so do artists. And in the case of writing, we're expected to just do free work. There's this sense of entitlement that people have. Sometimes people who either know us or knew us in the past, that we should just be able to do things like this for free. And as a matter of fact, if you look around the internet for even 5 minutes, you'll see lots of services, companies, organizations that get paid to do exactly that kind of work. I also routinely get asked when I publish a new book if somebody can have a free copy of it. Can you imagine asking a plumber if they'll come over and do your house for free? Nobody would even ask that of a dog sitter. So why would you ask a writer that? And so here's my first piece of advice for writers, if you've, especially if you've published anything. And there's no need to be a jerk about it, but I think it's fair to go back to people who ask you for free things like that, and ask them, well, what do you do for a living? And then they'll tell you, and you'll say, okay, how would you feel if I asked you to do that for free? Knowing that you've got to pay the rent and pay the bills and buy groceries and all that. So during the same week, I get a note from, I can't remember if it was LinkedIn or academia.edu, saying you have been specially selected to be one of the peers working on a special paper with this topic. And it's the same thing, right? I'm going to do this for free. That's what you're asking? I'm a professional writer and you want me to work for free. And I just have to add that, like many writers, I give away a lot of stuff. You go online and look up my website, there's all kinds of free articles there. I have free articles in LinkedIn, I have free articles in academia, and a bunch of other places. I've been giving away free stuff for years. So it's not all a matter of, oh, I'm greedy if I don't do this or any of that. As a writer, you can't be intimidated by that sort of. And so at one point, Mencius is not boasting when he says, I'm the same as those two, Yao and Shun. And we all are. For better or worse. And that means that we do things for a living, writing included. So while I'm on this, let me give you some examples of some areas where we don't get paid, need to do the writing anyway. I think it's wrong that we don't get paid for these, but um, if you don't do some of these, you won't advance your career as a writer. So at least at first, it might be smart, for instance, to contribute to either an anthology, which is a volume that publishes previously published work, or what's called an edited volume, which means you actually write an article or a chapter or what have you for that collection. So I've contributed to numerous edited volumes over the years, and I just know as an expectation that I won't get paid for it. They'll often, as a courtesy, the publisher will often send you a copy of the book, and that's nice. You can see yourself in print that way. When you're new at this, it's especially exciting, but you won't get published for that. So as a result, I've bowed out of some edited volumes just because I don't have the time to do a lot of free work when I'm trying to make a living. But at the beginning of my career, one of the first pieces of writing I did that was published was for an edited volume, and it helped me advance my other writing. So that's something to be aware of. Those of you who write fiction, you generally will get paid. So, like, say you dash off a piece to a magazine that publishes fiction, they'll give you such and such per word. Usually doesn't amount to much, and if you're new at it, again, it helps you build your record, which is important, especially if you plan on publishing a novel. So I would encourage you to do that, but without losing your sense of injustice at the shabby pay. If writers were paid by the hour fairly, we'd be much better off. I can write a pretty short nonfiction piece, a few pages in a day. Sometimes it takes me 2 days if I have to do research. If I was charging my consulting fee for that, that'd be a few $1,000s right there, sometimes more. Now, another skill that is absolutely necessary for keeping your dignity and believing in yourself as a writer is the ability to process criticism even when it hurts. So, as David Brin and a number of other people have pointed out, you can't improve as a writer unless you accept criticism. You just can't. And what I found sometimes is that there are people who deliver criticism who aren't good at being critics, and they let some contempt or meanness in. Fortunately, I haven't had to deal with a whole lot of that, but occasionally I have. And so I do a little exercise where if I'm having a bad day, usually it just rolls right off of me. But if I'm having a bad day and it's an ouch, then I sit with that for a bit. And then when the ouch fades, I ask myself, is there anything in this that I need to pay attention to that could benefit me as an improving writer? You also want to really pay attention to criticisms that are reflected over and over again back to you. So, for instance, when I started writing fiction, I got told by I think 4 or 5 different people that my stories read more like essays and that I was doing too many info dumps. That was excellent criticism. One of the rules that I live by when I attempt to write fiction is dramatize everything. So if they, you don't have to really do it this rigidly, but I try to convey information by converting it into a scene in the theater. If you can't see it on the stage, then maybe you're doing an info dump. So, as a writer, especially somebody who's starting out, you're going to have to accept a lot of criticism and really take it to heart if you're going to improve, because you must master this craft. And that also includes knowing which rules to follow and which rules to break. At first, you should probably just follow them all, so that you really learn them and really get a sense of which ones work for you. And I don't mean the silly old-fashioned ones like don't end a sentence with a preposition. I mean stuff more like when you hear experts say this is how you do a query letter to a publisher or an agent. You should probably do it exactly like that. 99.9% of rejections of your queries by agents and publishers do not mean you're a crappy writer or you've written a bad article or a book or whatever. They mean that you probably don't know how to write queries. And you can learn that. Another way to keep your dignity as a writer is to realize that although somebody might be more of an expert on the topic than you are, nobody can express it with the same uniqueness, the same soulfulness that you can. So, in addition to mastering the craft, you also need to be able to write with soul, to really pour your soul into your writing. Whatever the genre is, you can do this with technical writing, with academic writing, as well as with creativity, poetry, things like that. And incidentally, for that part, if you're interested, I actually have a little online mini course on writing with soul. If you go to my website, chalkwist.com, and you click on courses and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, it's hiding there. And speaking of hiding, if you're an introvert or you just have concerns about promoting your work, I got you covered there too. There's another course in there called Visibility for Introverts. It's all about promoting your work and not you, so that should let you off the hook a little bit. And I would say possibly the most important thing to remember in this difficult time for writers, in terms of keeping your soul and your integrity intact, is that when you make everything about the difficulty of externals, you really give your power away as a writer. So it's important to be able to understand when you're being disparaged as a writer. It's not personal, it's just a cultural habit. And when pay is lousy and when all the other market force conditions, I call it male fist capitalism, are against you, it's necessary to be realistic about all that, but it doesn't mean that you're out of options. A writer who takes the time to master their craft, to write with soul, and to produce really intriguing queries will get published, even if you're new at it. There's a common misconception out there that agents, for instance, don't take new writers. Agents love new writers. Agents want to be the person who can say, I'm the one who got them the breakthrough publicity. So sure, things are difficult. You'll probably have to write a lot of queries. You'll get rejected a bunch of times. I think for one of Stephen King's novels, he was rejected, 30 times? The novel Ordinary People, I think it was rejected more than 100 times, if I remember correctly. It takes persistence. And sure, you can just bypass all that and, publish it yourself online, self-publish. But when you do that, all the promotion's up to you. And you need to somehow pay for really rigorous editing, because if you don't, it'll be full of errors. You need to somehow round up some thoughtful critics so that your piece can be as strong as it can be by the time it gets published. And if you're an academic, a self-published book won't carry the weight that it will if it's a published, commercially published, peer-reviewed book. And the same applies to articles. Our economic system tries to convince us that what we write are just products for sale. But even as we work in that system, we realize that what we're writing are presences. They're creative beings who go out in the world and influence people and create new perceptions and new ideas. Beings whose scope we cannot tell in advance. So to give them a fair shake, we have to believe in them, as well as learning to believe in ourselves as writers with soul. Thank you.